All right. Well, thanks, Hazel. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We know that summer is an incredibly busy time for all of us, whether it's field work or personal time. So we really appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. So my name is Cynthia Garcia. I go by Cindy, and I'm a program manager with NOAA's Global Ocean Monitoring and Observing, specifically the Arctic Research Program. I'm joining this call from our ancestral home of the Anacostan and Piscataway peoples here in Maryland and Washington, D.C. So I'm thrilled to introduce the data management team within the IARPIC Arctic Research Plan framework. Data co-leads include Lauren Decker here in the call, as well as Maya Rita Williams and yours truly. So the team and our members work on advancing the objectives and specific actions toward a more fair or findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data, as well as to provide space to talk and to share resources about how we can also advance care, which is collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics data principles. So, for our meeting today, like what Hazel mentioned earlier, we are focusing on caring. So, caring for Arctic data and Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous peoples' rights to data through legal and relational frameworks. So, care principles and Indigenous data sovereignty are representations and expressions of the inherent and unique rights of tribal groups in the US and Indigenous peoples around the world. Through presentations today and the legal frameworks that will be shared of tribal and Indigenous peoples' rights to data and project specific navigations of these topics, this meeting today will highlight the legal and relational considerations concerning both care principles and IDS or Indigenous data sovereignty between federal employees, researchers, and Indigenous peoples, tribes in the Arctic. All right. And just like any other data management team meetings, we prepared a collaborative document for today's session. My colleague here will share the accessible link by chat. And the goal is to gather your experiences and also resources that you know of specific to your domains. We want to acknowledge that folks in the audience here are also experts in their specific domains here. So feel free to add any input along with the name and affiliation, your as well as any tools or links or other resources that you think would be relevant to facilitate the networking as well as collaboration among our attendees and speakers today. And if you don't have any access to the document, please let us know as well. All right. So now I'll pass it to my colleague here, Maya, to introduce our first speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Cindy. Hi, everyone. My name's Maya Retta Williams. I'm an employee of the Aleut community of St. Paul Island Tribal Government in the Ecosystem Conservation Office, as well as a non-federal co-lead with the data team. I'm joining the call from Sitka Kwan on Tlingit Ani, or Sitka, Alaska on Tlingit land. I'm honored to have both of our presenters here today for the second seminar of the Caring About Arctic Data seminar series, Rebecca Tsosie and Jim Thomson. We are going to ask that you hold all of your questions until the end of the presentation when we open up the floor, which will take place in roughly the last half hour of the session. And you're welcome to put any questions as well as we go in the chat, as well as any clarifying questions that you have during the presentations. And put those in the chat as well and can answer those. Without further ado, though, I'll introduce our first speaker and we'll get going. So Rebecca Tsosie, who is of Yaqui descent, is a Regents Professor and Morris K. Udall Professor of Law at the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona. Professor Tsosie teaches in the areas of federal Indian law, property, constitutional law, and cultural resources law. She was the first faculty executive director of ASU's Indian Legal Program and served in that position for 15 years. While at ASU, Professor Tsosie has held an academic appointment with the Faculty of Philosophy within the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and she served as an affiliate faculty member of the American Indian Studies program and a distinguished sustainability scientist for the Global Institute of Sustainability. As well, she serves as an appellate judge for the Supreme Court of the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation. Professor Tsosie received her Bachelor's of Arts in Juris Doctorate degrees at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she was also a president's postdoctoral fellow. And I think we can start sharing screen. And Rebecca, whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Maya. That was a wonderful introduction, and thanks to Hazel for operating the slides on my behalf. So I'm very grateful to be here this morning, and I really am impressed and appreciate the efforts that the data management team is developing for the IDSov collaborative. I had an introduction to the work that you're doing. I saw one of the first seminars, I believe, which was on that interface between the FAIR and CARE principles. And I have to say that this is a very exciting example to me of what is happening loosely in the realm of what we often refer to as knowledge co-production. That's a fancy term for saying within the various communities that we work with and are situated in, can we have a meaningful exchange about something like data management from within two very different frames and maybe multiple epistemologies about what constitutes data, what constitutes knowledge? Is knowledge a form of data? Is data a form of knowledge? These are the bigger picture questions that are happening right now as we contemplate the world that is influenced by artificial intelligence. But the baseline for knowledge co-production is to have a venue as we have today to bring people together to understand concepts and to talk in terms of what would be helpful within the disciplines, projects, initiatives, and communities that you all are part of. So I'm very honored to be here today, and I'm going to offer some preliminary remarks. Some of them will be baseline to some of you, but some people may need a baseline to be able to go more in detail. So first, I want to talk about what data sovereignty is. So next slide, Hazel, please. So this is a question that I get quite a bit, and I actually did my own migration from Arizona State University to University of Arizona in 2016 as part of an administrative appointment that would seek to expand and basically bring together the School of Medicine, the School of Law, the School of Public Health around health research. And so I came to the U of A, which has very robust health sciences programs, with the knowledge that I had about Indigenous governance and building and education and kind of capacity building among tribal nations. And the first colleagues that I met were a team of very young Indigenous postdocs and assistant professors that were working on this concept of Indigenous data sovereignty. That was not something I had been working on as a law professor. I wasn't familiar with the concept. And as I talked to them, I could see the utility within the health sciences, given what had happened in terms of misuse of physical samples of Indigenous genomic information, for example. There were pretty high-profile cases in the early 2000s that affected researchers. And so as I started to work with them, I saw that they were part of a broader global Indigenous data sovereignty movement with scholars from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and they were, of course, from the United States. Now, what was important to me about that moment was that here we were birthing a new construct that we were calling Indigenous data sovereignty without a lot of guidance from the normal legal sort of frameworks. And just to kind of give you a sense, I'm going to read a sentence before I get to what is posted on the slide. At that time, the global Indigenous sovereignty movement said Indigenous peoples and Native nations here in the United States ought to control the collection and use of data by and about them for their own purposes and in alignment with their collective right to self-determination. That's what the movement sought to do within the domestic law frameworks. Now, today, 2025, not quite 10 years later, we actually have a group that's meeting very shortly in 4 more days. And I was invited to be part of that, but I was unable to go to Geneva for the length of time it would take. But the United Nations group, which is MRIP, the expert mechanism. This is a group of Indigenous peoples, representatives from all over that go to the United Nations to articulate various important rights claims within the human rights structure. They are unveiling the first version of a report entitled Right of Indigenous Peoples to Data, including with regard to data collection and disaggregation. Now, what is important about that is that this has reached global resonance with governments across the world. And we need to have a working definition for all of those nation states to come together in the UN. So the operative definition that just got rolled out in the context of this report 2 weeks ago, Indigenous data sovereignty is defined as the right of Indigenous peoples to own, control, access, and possess data that derive from them and which pertain to their membership, knowledge systems, customs, or territories. That is the working international definition. Very important because those are the concepts that the legal frameworks and ethical frameworks will correspond to. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So in my remarks today, I want to talk about basically 4 components of that. So legal and ethical frameworks for Indigenous data sovereignty are under construction globally, nationally, and within Indigenous tribal governments and organizations and other communities, because globally, we actually don't have the same construct of a federally recognized Indian tribe. So globally, we have to be more expansive in terms of our definitions. So legal and ethical frameworks are being built, and therefore we need to understand the identity of this term, Indigenous peoples, as rights holders as a matter of both US domestic law, because that's where we're situated, and international law. Secondly, the foundational right of self-determination within human rights law is the baseline for the global work and the advocacy work. How does that map onto the third part of what I'll talk about, the domestic legal frameworks for Indigenous data sovereignty in the US? And then finally, the ethical dimensions, which is what is being built out internationally in that document, that will inform the further development of domestic law, both in this country and Canada and New Zealand, all the other countries. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to cover. And Hazel, maybe you can give me a signal if I'm running over time, because I'm a law professor. So once I start talking, anything could happen. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So the historical basis for tribal sovereignty, and this is the language that Indigenous data sovereignty in the United States has a certain resonance, because the US government does recognize tribal sovereignty as a formal concept and relationship, both in the law and in the political status over time. That is rooted in the colonial era, when various Indigenous nations had treaty relationships with Great Britain and other European sovereigns, the Dutch, other people. So in that early period, there was a political government-to-government relationship, and the British Crown is who we got the land from, that basically went to the United States upon the formation of the United States. United States, a very young country, 1776, the birth of the country, but it took a while to actually get the legal and political dynamics, both of the state-federal relationship and the tribal-federal relationship together. But that's where it stems from, and that makes it unlike any other group that would be assessed with status as an ethnic or racial group. It's a very different history. The whole conversation about DEI now is very fraught, but this goes way back, and it is definitely firmly related in the formation of the United States. The treaties that were used with Great Britain and the Indian nations also got brought into the tradition of the United States. The very first treaty was 1778 with the Delaware Nation and the United States. And in that treaty, the United States says, you're a nation, you're in control of your territory. We seek your consent to go across your territory to do what we need to do. And we want your military alliance against our common collective enemies. And we would like to work out something where we can get food from you, because they didn't have a lot of food and they weren't used to the land at that time. So that was the first treaty. There are over 500 of them that were signed before Congress ended treaty making for other reasons in 1871. The United States Constitution is the constitutional source of that political relationship being part of the U.S. framework, constitutional framework. That is Article 3, Section 8 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the exclusive authority to manage Indian affairs. And at that time, Indian affairs was basically deemed to be trade and intercourse with Indian nations and the United States. States couldn't get involved. It was purely regulated by Congress. The statutory basis of federal Indian law traces to the early Trade and Intercourse Acts, which stem from that constitutional authority. In the United States, that's how treaties are articulated in domestic law. The executive branch is very important. It basically makes the treaties with Indian nations. And again, that happened all the way up till 1871. And it also regulates the policies of federal agencies that work with Indigenous nations. That is very important in terms of where and how what I'm going to talk about next is the trust relationship gets articulated. But the baseline was that as essentially foreign nations in the beginning, Indian nations, the relationship was regulated by the War Department. When Interior was formed in 1849, the responsibility was shifted to the executive branch in the Department of Interior, where it remains today. But that is a unique history. Thank you. Next slide, please. So in teaching federal Indian law, which is really a course that is taught in a semester, but oftentimes over 2 semesters, if you have a law school that really wants to build this out, the framework legally is situated in 3 paramount cases in the 19th century when the U.S. Supreme Court was just emergent. Chief Justice John Marshall was the first Chief Justice, and he authored these 3 cases. And part of it is kind of insulting, Johnson v. McIntosh, the idea that at discovery, Europeans got title to the lands and Indian nations retained the right of occupancy. That always strikes my Native students as something very unfair and quite wrong. But what's important about that is that it says federal Indian law grew out of international law principles, co-joined with constitutional law principles. It still is that today. The Cherokee cases, could the state of Georgia basically shut down the Cherokee Nation's governance and put its own laws in place, negating tribal law? The famous cases articulated by Chief Justice John Marshall said, Indian nations are separate sovereigns. They have their own source of sovereignty. They're self-governing under their own laws and on their own territories. They would be internationally recognized nations, except they're in the United States geographically, they're not incorporated into the states, and the whole discourse with them is regulated by the federal government under an exclusive duty of protection. That gave rise to this idea of a domestic dependent nation, and the relationship there is described as a trust relationship today. Federal law preempts contrary state law. And so that is still a very important principle in federal Indian law and the subject of numerous cases on taxation and other matters. But that's the baseline. Okay, next slide, please. The plenary power doctrine is described in the 19th century as very expansive, giving Congress the power to do a lot of things to and for Indian nations that it wouldn't be able to do to anybody else. And that was situated in the 19th century with the guardian-ward relationship. Indian people as individuals were not citizens of the United States unless for separate reasons they got naturalized to citizenship. For example, Indian women who disclaimed their tribal relations and maybe married a non-Indian and wanted to live in the United States. There might be a process for naturalization for those people, but in general, they were non-citizens and they were wards. What does it mean to be a ward? It means that you don't have any constitutional civil rights and liberties. And that is why we got the boarding school policy, forcible removal of Indian children, appropriation of Indian lands, etc. So all of that was a product of wardship. 1924 turning point. By statute, all American Indian and Alaska Native people were naturalized to U.S. citizenship. And that statute specifically says this doesn't change anything about the tribal relation, about treaties. None of that group context was impaired, but individual civil rights had to be respected after 1924. So that's been kind of a work in progress for many years. But that's the trust relationship today. Okay, next slide, please.
We want to give you a 5-minute warning too.
5-minute warning. Okay. Okay. Well, I better completely go. That's the problem with PowerPoints. Okay. So, as we know, there are some 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. They are not racial groups, they're political groups, different equal protection analysis. Alaska is unique because it has both local village level governments that operate similar to those tribal governments here in the lower states. But here the reservations are held in trust status, and in Alaska, due to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the Venati case, there isn't a robust construct of Indian country except in very exceptional cases. So the Alaska Native corporations exercise governance authority as well as the local village corporations, but oftentimes a different governance model pertains. That may be important. Okay, next slide, please. There are other Indigenous peoples, which I'm not going to talk about here, but this would go to the global level. Native Hawaiian people, of course, are Indigenous, but have a different history. So the way that the trust works with them is very different. It's brokered by the state of Hawaii under very different terms. Next slide, please. Human rights law, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is what the baseline is, and that is the right to autonomy and self-governance under your own laws, customs on the territories of the people. So that's what that concept means. It's applicable to every Indigenous people, inherent right, but it has to be negotiated in terms of what that looks like legally with the nation state. Next slide, please. There are 4 frames of self-determination today. The sovereignty model you see in the US, self-management, which is the federal government creates a program, self-determination program, the tribal government assumes control over the program. You do see this in the health arena and other arenas. Co-management is where the tribe owns resources like forest resources that are adjacent to public land like federal parks. They can co-manage the forest as a unity because both of them have sovereign authority over their respective jurisdictions. And participatory governance would be the development of different forms, even corporate forms that operate school boards, transportation boards with state. And that, of course, calls for voting rights of Native people as citizens in addition to recognition of their separate status. Okay, next slide. Now, the legal frameworks for Indigenous data sovereignty, now, much of this may come up in the Q&A, but I'll just highlight them here. There are international frameworks and there are domestic frameworks, but they are not specific at this notion. The domestic framework of data sovereignty is located in federal law. And if I had more time, I would go through those, but it really is situated because of the Commerce Clause in the federal government. States have some authority, tribes have some authority, but the baseline is always going to be in the nation state. Next slide, please. Tribal law is what I am sort of immersed in right now with the communities that I am working with, and that is on how we, or should we, codify tribal views about knowledge production, data production. That whole effort is sustained with the sovereignty model, and that is a foundation for tribal federal sets of principles, such as I assume what you are building in IDSov. So tribal law and federal law, very, very important in terms of their relationship in Indigenous data sovereignty. But collection of data is happening all over the place. It's happening with third parties. It's happening off reservation with individuals who have apps on their phone. That's an area that is completely open right now and much harder to regulate. Next slide, please. These are some of the active fields of inquiry that we could talk about. What happens to data that was gathered in the past and is now archived in these various collections? Who controls the interpretation of that data, the use of the data? Who has the right to consent to current studies where data is being gathered? Maybe some of those will be off reservation. How do we approach those? What data management practices and policies are necessary to safeguard data, sensitive data, for example, and what contractual provisions can be built to the extent that there are partnership models to honor the central principle that is coming out of the human rights arena, which is secure and ensure free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous community to whatever the proposed acquisition and use of data is. Okay, next slide, please. There are emerging issues, and artificial intelligence opens the door to so many. I can't even describe that, so we could talk about that. But what is really good from my perspective is that there are many agencies, foundations, and even private corporations that are reaching out, wanting to make intentional voluntary efforts to work with Indigenous peoples and create effective models for Indigenous data sovereignty. So I'm very heartened to see that. Next slide, please. And the final point is that Indigenous data is a component of Indigenous cultural heritage. And there's an Article 31 of the UN Declaration that talks about, from within Indigenous worldviews, the tangible world is co-joined inseparably in many cases with the intangible world. So that's why intellectual property rights in Indigenous heirloom seeds is kind of a challenge, right? Because there's a tangible seed which could be grown and traded, but then there's this intangible, the knowledge that surrounds that. This is what we are creating right now, is the standards that actually fit a different set of epistemic models. And that is why knowledge co-production is very important, but requires the participation of Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. The ethical principles, I think all of you are very immersed in this, but that is what the international paradigm is corresponding to, because the data practices in these big multinational databases are really calling upon a principled effort to maintain these ethical principles across the various avenues where they're being used, whether that's environmental, health, weather, whatever the case may be. So that is what is underway, and knowing that Indigenous peoples have different values, and some of them correspond to specific groups, women, elders, clan leaders, spiritual leaders. So it's very important to have that dialogue in a respectful way. And next slide, please. The spiritual values we get about, there is and this is not religion, this is the intergenerational relationship of Indigenous peoples in specific places across multiple generations. That is a specific view, and spiritual rights are unique to Indigenous peoples in international human rights law. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So that was a lot. These are articles and chapters that I've written, which I can make available, but I completely appreciate your time and attention. I'm sorry if I went too long. I look forward to the next presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. As we are transitioning slides over, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Jim Thomson, who is a senior principal oceanographer at the University of Washington's Applied Physics Lab and a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He earned a PhD in applied ocean physics and engineering from MIT's joint program in the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Dr. Thomas studies waves and turbulence at the surface of the ocean, including interactions with sea ice. His work emphasizes field measurements and physical processes, and his lab group has developed the Swift and MicroSwift buoy platforms. His lab group also maintains long-term wave measurement records at the Ocean Station Papa in the Beaufort Sea. And take it away, Jim.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. I am going to give you something that is very different from what we just heard about legal structures, and hopefully in the Q&A we can try to make these things intersect. But I'm going to tell you about measurements of the physical environment in the ocean, the ice, and somewhat the land around the community of Utqiagvik in the very northern portion of the Alaska North Slope. And start by just telling you I have no background in any of the legal aspects of this. I am just a physical scientist, and I have been sort of stumbling along for my 25-year career, trying to do the best I can to share data and make it useful to communities and understand the communities I'm working in. But I have no formal background in any of it. I am just muddling through, as they say. So I'll tell you about this specific project as an example of where things work and where things don't work. And it surrounds this particular region. This region is governed by, in part, by the North Slope Borough. So NSB means the North Slope Borough, and that's the borough that has all the North Slope villages of Alaska in it. And some of the partners in this project you'll see listed here are the North Slope Borough Department of Search and Rescue, so obviously a very operational part of the local government. And then wildlife management, also, a very science-based and has a lot of Western science, but also traditional Indigenous knowledge in their practice, and has a lot of operational aspects too, just in terms of sustainable harvesting and those kind of things. And then we have a logistics provider locally that is also part of the Native Corporation, and UIC Science provides all our logistics. So those are the local partners on this project. And then we have the academic partners, who are sort of the traditional academic folks doing their research and trying to publish papers and come up with archival quantitative data sets. And so that's hopefully we'll see where these all intersect. And there's a QR code there for the website, which I want to showcase just as a place where we do our data dissemination, where we make the data available and as close to real time as possible to the community. The website's been a big part of how we've been trying to do that with, I would say, mixed success. So this is one specific project. I want to start by just noting that there are all these other efforts going on throughout the Alaskan Arctic that have been longstanding, and I think are actually, in my opinion, much better examples of how the local communities are generating and gathering and sharing their own data for their own purposes. So the AOK, the Knowledge Hub, I think is an excellent example, and it's been going for quite a while now. There's some really active community observers making both quantitative and qualitative observations, and there's a whole archive of that is available for use. And as a scientist, I use it when I'm going to a new area. I go look at this and say, you know, what are people seeing? What is the ice looking like? What's been happening recently? Because these descriptive qualitative observations of the physical environment are very insightful. So I think that program is one to highlight. And then the Backyard Buoys program is more recent and ongoing. And I think that's also been excellent, where these local communities are putting out buoys that have real-time data that's available on an app, and they're using it for safety at sea and to know their environment, and they're maintaining them, and they have control of the data, and I think that's excellent. Now to this specific project. This project's about landfast ice, and just if most of people on the call are Arctic folks in some way, shape, or form, so you're probably familiar with the concept of landfast ice. I just want to point out that it's an essential part of the Arctic environment, I think, as a scientist, and I think the indigenous communities would agree for other reasons, you know, because the landfast ice is a base which to go hunting, just for transportation, just you know, thoroughfares for transport, to, you know, drive the cars that come up the haul road to Prudhoe Bay and then go across to Barrow and deliver cars in the winter, and all these other uses of the landfast ice. So here's an example. This was taken from the AEWC publication, and showing a camp, you know, ready for whaling, looking out on the water, looking for whales ready to whale. So landfast ice is essential for this mode of hunting, and it's essential for the communities. And this is important for me as a scientist when I come work in this environment, because I want to make sure that I am not in the way of this. If I can support this in any way and provide data that's useful to these folks out here whaling, then great. But number one, do no harm. I want to not be in the way. And so the thing I've heard loud and clear and have internalized is that subsistence is the priority in these communities, in these environments, and our science, if it can support that, that's great. It certainly should not get in the way of that. So that's the sort of first thing I'm always thinking of when we're working in these areas. Our specific project is to work in this landfast ice and to understand it in the springtime when it is attached to the coast, and then eventually pieces of it break away and it melts and it breaks up, and then eventually it all goes away. And understanding when and why that happens has a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of melting that happens, that's warming, that's thermodynamic. There's also a lot of mechanical or dynamic work that happens, and that's wind and waves and ocean currents pushing and pulling on the ice that try to move the ice away. So we're always thinking about heat and motion together. So we have a suite of sensors, some of them new, some of them old, that we've been putting out this spring and will do in the future springs, to try to understand and be able to predict when the ice goes out. And that's really about, you know, where this comes back to search and rescue, is that is it safe to go out on the ice? And if you go on the ice today, is it likely that a piece is going to break away and now suddenly you're drifting in the Arctic Ocean, where you thought you were going to just drive your snow machine back to land and go home for the night, but now there's an ocean in between you and that. And that certainly has happened. And North Slope Borough Search and Rescue has had to pick people up off of floating pieces of ice, which is a difficult thing to do, and we want to be able to avoid that by having a better understanding of the day-to-day safety of the ice. Here's the schematic of what we're trying to do. So, and the project is called Arctic Pisces. I didn't choose the acronym, and I won't dwell on it because I don't like it, but there it is. And here's all these various scientific instruments that are out there. They're almost all autonomous, and so that means they sit out there on their own while we're warm and dry back at camp, and they report their data to us about what the ice is doing. The key thing about setting this all up is having this existing indigenous knowledge to build on. So here's a photo of Charlie. He was one of our guides from UIC Science this spring while we were out there, and people like Charlie make this happen. You know, he has lived most of his life in Utqiagvik. He has hunted everywhere and knows the place well. And so we get there and we hire UIC Science to provide us with guides that are bear guards, and also guides for safely getting around the ice and going around. And we don't go anywhere without them. And I think that's a very functional relationship, right? We're paying them for this service, but I think it's also a very important one. First, we're paying people for their time. We're not just asking, hey, can you show us around? We're paying them for their services. And I think that employment aspect is important, practical, but it's important. And second, we just learn a lot from just seeing what they see and how they understand the ice. On the right-hand side is some prior work that was done as part of the local observing network to understand how the currents move the ice around. So I won't walk you through the whole schematic, but basically the winds matter a lot. And anyone who has spent their lives hunting there knows that. And they're constantly watching the winds and watching for what the current is doing in response to the winds and then where that's going to carry the ice. So this is a region where people have lived for millennia, and there's a lot of existing knowledge about how the ice moves and when the ice is safe and when the ice is not safe. So we come in acknowledging that and trying to build on that. We had our first of 3 field years this spring. So here's a quick highlight of what we did this spring. We were up in the region for about 2 weeks. We put out lots of buoys on the ice or through the ice and set things up for ongoing data collection. Here's a satellite photo when we were working. So the town is actually down here just off the image. And then the old NARL Naval Arctic Research Lab is around here. And then the actual point barrow, the geographic point, is here. Utqiagvik is down here. And then this is the lagoon back here. So this is all open ocean through here. And this is the fast ice. It's stuck. This is mobile drifting ice out here. And this bit of dark stuff, that's patches of open water. And throughout the spring, these open water comes and goes. And that's really important for the community for whaling. If there's open water, you can find whales and hunt whales. And if there's not, it's almost impossible to do. So how much open water there is a big deal. And you can see the satellite photo is really useful, right? And we can accumulate lots of satellite photos. And this is an animation made by Laura Cruz, who's a postdoc working on the project. And you get a real picture of the larger scale phenomenon that's happening. So this whole box exists within the small yellow box. And in the larger scale, this is all the Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Sea. And here's the landmass of Alaska. And then there's the fast ice that's stuck to the coast. And then there's a lot of clouds, but there's a lot of ice moving around, a lot of things happening. So very dynamic environment. And what's happening upstream in the Beaufort is pretty important to setting this all up. So we use the satellite data. And our website in part just makes the satellite data available to the community because sometimes it's hard to find or hard to get. That's getting better now with apps like the Siku app that I think is used by a lot of indigenous communities. But historically, I think all this great satellite data has been hard for these communities to access because they haven't had sufficient internet and bandwidth, and they just haven't had a platform to do it. So I think our website, the Siku app, other places are making this satellite data more available, and I think that's a good outcome. I still think you need a lot of GIS skills and computers to analyze all of this. So how best to have the communities use it is still that's very much a work in progress. But something that I think is even better than this satellite is a local product. So the satellite's only once a day, and that really misses a lot. But the University of Alaska at Fairbanks and Andy Mahoney have had a radar mounted near the town, and that is running all the time, 24 hours a day. So that is this circle here. The orange circle is the radar range. And here's what it looks like from the center of town. It's mounted to the bank building in town. And this is the coast, this is the land, and then you see this is the fast ice, and then this is an event where the lead of open water closes, and all this drifting ice comes in and smashes into that and closes up that lead. And this is something that you can see, anyone in the community can see this in real time. There's a web server that is showing the radar output in real time all the time. And this was predating the project that I'm telling you about now. Andy's been doing this for almost 10 years. And it is extremely popular with the local community and hunting and whaling folks. They use this as a resource all the time. And so I think it's a great example of something. It's very operational. It's very real time. This isn't, although the data are archived and there's public access to it, I don't get the sense the community is using it much in a retrospective sense. I think they're using it to look at, today, is the ice moving? Can I go out on the ice? What's the extent of the fast ice? How far can I go? If I'm going to build a trail out to a new whaling camp, what does the ice look like? There's some texture here in the ice, and the smooth ice is usually easy trail building, and the rough ice is difficult. Those kind of questions. So I think it's been a great resource, and I'm glad to see it continuing kind of get incorporated into our present project. Here's what that looks like in person. I just want to make this contrast between, if you haven't seen land fast ice and mobile ice next to it, this is what it looks like when you're standing. I did speed this movie up a little bit just to make it obvious, but it's amazing to be where I'm standing taking this video is 2 miles out from the coast. So it's sea ice, but it's ice that's attached to the coast. It's not moving, and this stuff is just clocking by. So again, a very dynamic environment, and you want to be standing where I'm standing right now taking this video. You do not want to be out there in that drifting stuff, right? And then you want to know, is the piece I'm standing on gonna still be there 10 minutes from now? That's the kind of really operational thing you want to know, and that we're hoping to provide at least that to the community through the radars and then through the buoys, which you can watch and see if they move. So on to those buoys. Here's what the buoys look like. We put out 10 of them throughout this whole region. Here's a little, so this is a very busy slide, but there's a little image of the buoys. Here's us deploying the buoys. And then the big thing I want to emphasize is this blue box right here, that we spent a bunch of time this spring making sure these data and the buoy positions and their motion would be available on the Backyard Buoys website. And I think that's the best way, in my experience, to get data into the hands of the communities, is to use something that's already working for them. So Backyard Buoys is an existing program. People like Shana Wisdom and AECWC have spent a bunch of time getting it stood up and getting people using it. I don't take any credit for that at all. I just am glad that they were welcoming to us to pipe our data into their platform, because people are already using it. So let's make it easy on people, and they have this common interface. Most people have the apps on their phone if they're actively out on the water or on the ice. So it's a different buoy type than they started with, but they were happy to ingest another buoy type. We made our data format work for them, and now in real time, you can go to that website and you can say, are those buoys out there in the ice moving? Are they measuring any waves, which would indicate maybe that the ice is about to break free, that kind of thing. So I think that's been a big success. We also put out some moorings, and the website has the mooring data. And what's neat about that is we tethered the moorings to some seafloor sensors, and we can see warm water sneaking in under the ice, which we think is another precursor to ice breakout. Some warm water comes in and the ocean starts to melt the ice from below, or at least loosen up the grounded part of the ice. And that's another term in addition to the sunlight coming down from above, providing heat that melts the ice in the springtime. So that's some important data. Okay, I want to start to wrap up and just to give you a couple other thoughts about working in these local communities. I've been working in this region for about 15 years, and one of the things I think has gone the best is bringing the local data into the local schools. So here's some pictures of working in, this is actually from Utqiagvik, which is another village in the North Slope, but it's close by. And we've developed, as part of a prior project funded by the National Science Foundation, we developed like a course pack, basically, of 5 lessons that were suitable for middle to high school students to do Arctic coastal oceanography. So we've gone to Utqiagvik a couple times now and spent a few days, about a week on site, going through this curriculum and having the students assemble instruments, take those instruments out, measure the currents and the temperatures and the water levels, and then come back and talk about the data. So trying to take them all the way through, what kind of data do you want to collect? Where do you want a measurement? What do you think is going to happen? What's your hypothesis for, as the tide comes in, is it going to get warmer or colder? Where do you like to go fishing? Where do you like to go hunting? Let's get some data there, and then let's look at it together. So I think the kids in general have been very engaged, and it's been pretty successful. And the school, provides some structure for it and some resources for, here's how we can look at the data. So this has been one of my favorite things so far. And then, again, I started out by saying I've been muddling through, and I just want to be really honest about that and just give you some reflections on what has worked and what has not worked. More just in general engagement in these Indigenous communities. So all along the North Slope, here's a map here of all the different communities. They each have a little circle around them. This is from the Brenda Konar's paper on best practices for working in and around the whaling communities. And they each have this circle around, which is a no-go zone. So, stay out of here, and then you won't get in the way of subsistence activities because you'll be far enough away from the villages. It turns out, of course, it's a lot more nuanced than that, and that publication is maybe a little bit dated now, but I think it still was a nice place where someone was writing down, here's what you should be trying to be doing, here's how to engage. And if you are trying to do your science in these regions, when there's subsistence activity happening, then here's what to be aware of. So anyway, here's some anecdotes from me, is the importance of local liaisons and the importance of paying people for their time. So having local logistical support is of great practical utility, but it also means that you just have a better understanding of what's happening around town and around the community. And it seems obvious, but I can't stress this enough to, don't show up and ask people to volunteer their information or their time or their input. pay them for their time, even if it's a 20-minute meeting to tell you about something. Like, pay people for their time. That's pretty simple. To start out by listening, to not assume that this science that you have to share is actually interesting to the locals, or that it's even relevant to the things that they're concerned with and care about. I've shown up occasionally and started to talk about all this ocean stuff, and had someone say, "Look, food security is our biggest issue. This is nice about the currents in the ocean, but that's not what we're worried about right now, Jim." So it's been important to just listen and understand what's essential to the community, and then see if there's an intersection with the science that you're trying to do. I also acknowledge that there are many voices, so you might get one person saying, "This is great, we love having your science here," and the next day you get yelled at by somebody for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And these communities are complex places, and they're not going to all speak with one voice and have a universal set of input to the science, or the intersection of your science and their needs that you're trying to achieve. And the other thing is just the time spent is so valuable that there's really no replacement for being in person in the community for substantial amounts of time. Helicopter parachuting in and being there for 24 hours to give a quick talk and leave is pretty ineffective, I think. And so when you show up with your sort of westernized timeline and say, "Well, I got to do this, and I got to get out of here," that it just doesn't really work. So just spending a lot of time has been probably the most productive thing, the thing where I've learned the most, and just being willing to participate in anything that's offered. If you're invited to a meal or something, that I have gained a lot from just saying yes to those things. So I'll close with that. I know that's super anecdotal, but yeah, again, I don't have any formal background in this. I've just been in this region trying to do the best I can for a while now. So thank you.
Thank you so much to both of our wonderful speakers. And yeah, definitely two very different presentations, but I think, Jim, I appreciated how much you highlighted the governance systems that you were working within, and how that really shapes our data relationships, as well as these legal frameworks that Rebecca is talking about. We are going to open up now. I think we're going to stop the recording.